The courthouse steps felt cold beneath my feet as I stood there, holding the deed to 650 acres of Texas ranch land, my hands shaking not from the October wind, but from the weight of what had just happened. Alexander Gomez, the lawyer who had been fighting for me these past 6 months, placed his hand on my shoulder and said the words I never thought I would hear. "You won, Noah. The ranch is legally yours. Your grandmother wanted you to have it, and no one can take that away from you now." I stared down at the paper in my hands, at my name written in official legal script. Noah Gonzalez, rightful heir to the Gonzalez family ranch. 6 months ago, I had never heard of this place. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in a group home, counting down the days until my 18th birthday, when I would age out of the system with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and a heart full of questions about why my family had never wanted me. But standing there on those courthouse steps, watching Jessica Cooper, my supposed aunt who had tried to steal my inheritance, storm away in defeat, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my story had been wrong. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This journey changed everything I believed about family, belonging, and what it means to truly come home. Let me take you back to where it all began, 3 days after my 18th birthday, in a group home in Houston, where the walls were painted the color of old mustard and the air always smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. I had been living at Riverside Youth Center for 2 years, ever since my last foster placement fell apart when the family decided they wanted a younger kid, someone with fewer trust issues and less baggage. At 18, I was officially too old for the system, which meant I had exactly 72 hours to figure out where I was going to live, how I was going to eat, and what I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. The other kids in the home were younger, mostly between 12 and 16, and they looked at me with a mixture of respect and pity. I was the oldest, the one who had survived the longest in the system, but I was also the one about to get kicked out with nowhere to go. I had saved up $800 from my part-time job at a grocery store, which might cover a security deposit on some rundown apartment if I was lucky, but definitely would not last long after that. I was sitting on my narrow bed, stuffing my few possessions into the same black garbage bag I had carried from placement to placement for the past 10 years, when Betty Nguyen, the caseworker, knocked on my door. She was holding a manila envelope and wearing an expression I had never seen before, something between confusion and excitement. "Noah," she said, sitting down on the edge of my bed, "we need to talk. I have something here that is going to sound absolutely crazy, but I need you to listen to me carefully." I stopped packing and looked at her. Betty had been my caseworker for 6 months, and she was one of the good ones, the kind who actually cared about what happened to the kids in her caseload. If she said something was important, I listened. "This morning," she continued, "I got a call from a law firm in Austin. Apparently your grandmother passed away 3 months ago, and she left you something in her will." I stared at her for a long moment, trying to process what she had just said. My grandmother. I had never known I had a grandmother. According to my file, my mother had died in a car accident when I was 8, and my father was listed as unknown. There had never been any mention of other family members, no grandparents or aunts or uncles who might take me in. "What kind of something?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Betty opened the envelope and pulled out several official-looking documents. "A ranch," she said, her voice filled with disbelief. 650 acres in a town called Cedar Creek, about 2 hours northwest of Austin. "The lawyer says it has been in your family for 3 generations. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. A ranch. My family had owned a ranch, and somehow no one in the system had ever known about it. For 10 years, I had been shuffled from home to home, believing I had no family, no roots, no place where I belonged. And all this time, there had been land with my name on it, waiting for me. "How is that possible?" I asked, taking the documents from Betty with trembling hands. "How could no one know about this?" "The lawyer, a man named Alexander Gomez, explained that your grandmother, Maria Gonzalez, had been estranged from your mother for many years before your mother died. When she found out about your mother's death, she tried to find you, but by then, you were already in the system, and there were some complications with the paperwork. She spent years trying to track you down, but the bureaucracy made it nearly impossible." I looked down at the documents, trying to make sense of the legal language. There was a copy of a will, dated just 4 months ago, that clearly stated that all of Maria Gonzalez's property and assets were to be left to her grandson, Noah Gonzalez. There was also a letter written in careful handwriting on cream-colored paper. "My dearest Noah," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I have found you at last, even if I could not do so while I was alive. I have spent the last 10 years searching for you, trying to bring you home where you belong. I know you must have questions, and I know you must be angry that I was not there for you when you needed family most. I cannot undo the years you spent alone, but I can give you the land that has been in our family since 1873. And I can tell you that you were loved even when you did not know it." The letter went on to explain that my mother, Elena, had left home at 17 after a fight about her boyfriend, my father, who my grandmother had not approved of. When Elena died, my grandmother had tried to find me, but the state had sealed my records, and without proof of her relationship to me, she had been unable to get custody. She had hired lawyers and private investigators, but the system had failed us both. "I am old now," the letter continued, "and my health is failing, but I have made sure that everything is in order for you to inherit this land when you turn 18. It is not much, but it is yours by right, and it is a place where you can build a life, where you can belong to something bigger than yourself. There is a small house on the property, and the land is good for cattle or horses if you choose to work it. More importantly, there are people in Cedar Creek who knew your great-grandfather and your grandfather. People who will remember your family and welcome you home." At the bottom of the letter was a phone number for Alexander Gomez and instructions to call him as soon as I received the letter. I sat there on my bed, holding this letter from a grandmother I had never known, feeling like my entire world had been turned upside down. For 18 years, I had believed I was completely alone in the world. Now I was learning that I had family, that I had a history, that somewhere in Texas there was a place that had been waiting for me my entire life. Betty was watching me carefully, probably trying to gauge my reaction. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I do not know," I said honestly. "This does not feel real." "The lawyer wants to meet with you as soon as possible," Betty said. "There are some legal things that need to be handled, and apparently there is some urgency because someone else is trying to claim the property." That got my attention. Someone else. "Your grandmother had a daughter-in-law, Jessica Cooper, who was married to your Uncle Frank. Frank died 5 years ago, but Jessica is claiming that the will is invalid and that as Frank's widow, she has a right to the property. She has been living on the ranch since your grandmother died, and she is not planning to leave without a fight." I felt a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. This woman, this stranger, was trying to steal the one thing my family had left for me, the one place in the world where I might finally belong. "When can we meet with the lawyer?" I asked. 3 days later, I was sitting in the law offices of Gomez and Associates in downtown Austin, wearing the only dress shirt I owned and feeling completely out of place among the polished wood furniture and leather-bound books. Alexander Gomez was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake, and when he looked at me, I could see that he genuinely cared about the outcome of this case. "Noah," he said, settling behind his desk with a thick file folder, "I want you to know that your grandmother was a remarkable woman. She never gave up hope of finding you, and she made very sure that her wishes regarding this property were legally sound. However, we do have some challenges ahead of us." He opened the folder and spread several documents across his desk. "Jessica Cooper has hired her own lawyer, and they are claiming that your grandmother was not of sound mind when she wrote this will. They are also arguing that since you were never in contact with your grandmother, you cannot be considered her legitimate heir." "Is that true?" I asked, feeling a knot of worry in my stomach. "Absolutely not," Alexander said firmly. "I knew your grandmother personally. I helped her search for you, and I can testify that she was completely lucid and determined when she made this will. As for the inheritance, Texas law is very clear about bloodline inheritance rights. You are her direct descendant, and that supersedes any claims from in-laws." He pulled out a map and spread it across the desk. "This is your property," he said, pointing to a large section outlined in red. 650 acres with a main house, a barn, and several outbuildings. There is also a small herd of cattle, about 50 head, and some farming equipment. The property is worth approximately $1.2 million. I stared at the map, trying to comprehend what he was telling me. $1.2 million. I had never had more than $1,000 to my name, And now I was potentially inheriting more money than I could even imagine. But here is the problem, Alexander continued. Jessica Cooper has been living on the property since your grandmother died, and she has been running the ranch operation. She claims that she has invested her own money into improvements and that she should be compensated for her work. More importantly, she has been telling the community that she is the rightful owner, and some of the neighbors have been supporting her claim. Why would they do that, I asked. Because they do not know you, Alexander said gently. Cedar Creek is a small town, and people there knew your grandmother for decades. They also knew Jessica and Frank. You are a stranger to them, someone who never visited, never called, never showed any interest in the family land. From their perspective, Jessica has been taking care of the property, and you are just some kid trying to swoop in and take advantage of an old woman's generosity. I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment. It was not my fault that I had never visited. It was not my fault that I had not known this place existed, but I could understand how it might look to people who did not know the whole story. What do we need to do? I asked. First, Alexander said, we need to go to Cedar Creek and assert your legal right to the property. I have filed papers with the county court, and there will be a hearing in 2 weeks to determine the validity of the will. In the meantime, you have the right to inspect the property and to begin taking possession of it. He handed me a set of keys. These are to the main house. Your grandmother left specific instructions that you should have access to her personal belongings, including some family photographs and documents that might help you understand your history. I took the keys, feeling their weight in my palm. They were old-fashioned skeleton keys, the kind that looked like they belonged in a movie about the Old West. I should warn you, Alexander continued, that Jessica Cooper is not going to welcome you with open arms. She has been living in that house for 3 months, and she considers it her home. She may try to intimidate you or make you feel unwelcome. Do not let her. You have every legal right to be there. What if she refuses to let me in? Then we call the sheriff, Alexander said. I have already spoken with Sheriff Aaron Robinson, and he understands the situation. He will enforce your rights if necessary. I left the lawyer's office with a folder full of documents, a set of keys, and directions to a place I had never been, but that was supposedly my home. Betty had agreed to drive me to Cedar Creek the next morning, partly because I did not have a car, and partly because she wanted to make sure I was safe during this transition. That night, I lay awake in my narrow bed at the group home, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine what this ranch would look like, what my grandmother's house would feel like, what it would be like to walk on land that had belonged to my family for generations. I thought about my mother, Elena, and wondered what had driven her away from this place. I thought about my grandmother, Maria, and felt a deep sadness that we had never had the chance to meet. Most of all, I thought about Jessica Cooper and what would happen when I showed up at her door with keys to what she considered her home. I had spent my entire life being unwanted, being moved from place to place whenever I became inconvenient. I was not going to let someone take away the one place where I might finally belong. The next morning, Betty picked me up in her Honda Civic, and we drove northwest from Houston toward Cedar Creek. The landscape gradually changed from urban sprawl to rolling hills dotted with oak trees and cattle ranches. As we got closer to our destination, I found myself pressing my face to the window, trying to catch glimpses of what might be my new home. Cedar Creek turned out to be the kind of small Texas town that looked like it had been frozen in time somewhere around 1950. There was a main street with a diner, a feed store, a bank, and a few other businesses, all housed in brick buildings with hand-painted signs. Pickup trucks were parked diagonally along the street, and I could see several men in cowboy hats talking outside the feed store. Betty pulled over in front of the diner and consulted the directions Alexander had given us. According to this, she said, the ranch is about 5 miles outside of town, on County Road 47. We drove out of town on a 2-lane highway that wound through pastures and farmland. Finally, Betty turned onto a gravel road marked with a weathered sign that read Gonzales Ranch, established 1873. My heart started pounding as we drove up the long driveway, past fields where cattle grazed under the spreading branches of live oak trees. In the distance, I could see a cluster of buildings, a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a large red barn, and several smaller outbuildings. As we pulled up to the house, I saw a woman come out onto the porch. She was in her 40s, with bleached blonde hair and a hard expression, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. Even from a distance, I could tell she was not happy to see us. That must be Jessica Cooper, Betty said quietly. I took a deep breath, grabbed the keys from my pocket, and got out of the car. Jessica Cooper stood on the porch with her arms crossed, watching us approach with the kind of look that could freeze water in July. She was smaller than I had expected, but there was something fierce about the way she held herself, like a cornered animal ready to fight. You must be Noah, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I have been expecting you. I am, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I believe you know why I am here. Oh, I know exactly why you are here, Jessica said, stepping down from the porch to block our path to the front door. You are here because some lawyer filled your head with fairy tales about inheriting something that does not belong to you. Betty stepped forward, her caseworker instincts kicking in. Ma'am, I am Betty Nguyen from Child Protective Services, and I am here to help Noah transition to his new living situation. We have legal documents that clearly establish his right to this property. Legal documents, Jessica laughed, but there was no humor in it. Let me tell you something about legal documents, honey. I have been living on this ranch for 5 years, taking care of Maria when she was sick, running this operation when she could not do it herself. I have invested my own money into improvements, and I have kept this place from falling apart. That boy there, she pointed at me with a finger that shook with anger, never called, never visited, never showed one bit of interest in his so-called family until there was money involved. I felt my face burn with shame and anger. That is not fair, I said. I did not know this place existed. I did not know I had a grandmother. Convenient, Jessica said. Very convenient. And now you think you can just show up here and take everything Maria worked for, everything my husband Frank helped build. Frank was not Maria's son, Betty said calmly. According to our records, he was her son-in-law, and he passed away 5 years ago. That does not give you any legal claim to this property. Jessica's face darkened. You do not know anything about this family or this ranch. Frank was more of a son to Maria than Elena ever was. Elena broke that old woman's heart when she ran off with some loser and got herself killed. Frank was the one who stayed, who took care of the land, who made sure Maria was not alone. I felt something twist in my chest at the way she talked about my mother, but I forced myself to stay calm. I am not here to fight with you, I said. I just want to see the house and understand what my grandmother left for me. Jessica stared at me for a long moment, her eyes calculating. Finally, she stepped aside. Fine, she said. Go ahead and look around, but do not think for 1 second that this is over. I have lived here for 5 years, and I am not going anywhere without a fight. I walked up the porch steps, my hands shaking slightly as I fumbled with the old skeleton key. The front door was solid wood, painted white but showing signs of age and weather. When the key turned and the door swung open, I stepped into my grandmother's house for the first time. The interior was exactly what I had imagined a ranch house should look like. The living room had hardwood floors covered with colorful rugs, furniture that looked comfortable and lived in, and walls covered with family photographs spanning decades. There was a stone fireplace with a mantel lined with small decorative items and windows that looked out over the front pasture. But what struck me most was how clean and well-maintained everything was. This was not the house of someone who had been neglected or forgotten. Someone had been taking care of this place, keeping it ready for company, keeping it alive. I walked slowly through the rooms, taking in every detail. The kitchen had white cabinets and a farmhouse sink with a breakfast table positioned near a window that offered a view of the barn. The bedrooms were simply furnished but comfortable, with quilts on the beds and family photographs on the dressers. In what was obviously my grandmother's bedroom, I found a dresser covered with framed pictures. There were old black and white photographs of people I did not recognize, probably my great-grandparents and other relatives from generations past. But there were also more recent pictures, including several of a young woman who looked remarkably like me. My mother, Elena. I picked up one of the photographs, a picture of my mother as a teenager, standing next to a horse in front of the barn. She was smiling, her dark hair catching the sunlight, and she looked happy and carefree in a way I had never seen in the few pictures I had of her. Behind me, I heard footsteps, and I turned to see Jessica standing in the doorway, watching me with an unreadable expression. That was taken the summer before she left, Jessica said quietly. She was 16, and she thought she knew everything about everything. She was beautiful, I said, still holding the photograph. She was stubborn, Jessica said. Just like her mother, Maria tried to tell her that boy she was running around with was no good, but Elena would not listen. She thought love was enough to overcome anything. What happened to my father? I asked. Jessica shrugged. He took off when Elena got pregnant, left her alone with a baby and no way to support herself. Maria begged her to come home, but Elena was too proud. She would rather struggle on her own than admit she had made a mistake. I set the photograph back on the dresser, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Sadness for my mother, who had died so young, anger at my father, who had abandoned us both, and a deep, aching regret for all the years I had missed with my grandmother. There are more pictures in the living room, Jessica said, her voice softer now. Maria kept every school picture, every newspaper clipping, every piece of information she could find about you. She never stopped looking, never stopped hoping she would find a way to bring you home. I followed Jessica back to the living room, where she pointed to a bookshelf I had not noticed before. The bottom shelf was filled with photo albums and scrapbooks. I pulled out one of the albums and opened it to find pages and pages of information about me. School pictures from elementary school that I did not even remember having taken. Newspaper clippings from academic awards I had won. Even printouts of social media posts from foster families I had lived with. How did she get all this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She hired private investigators, Jessica said. She spent thousands of dollars over the years, trying to piece together your life, trying to find a way to reach you. Every time she thought she had a lead, the trail would go cold. The system is designed to keep families apart, not bring them together. I sank into one of the armchairs, still holding the photo album, feeling overwhelmed by the evidence of my grandmother's love and determination. All those years I had felt abandoned and forgotten. She had been fighting for me, searching for me, documenting my life from a distance. Why are you showing me this? I asked Jessica. Because, she said, settling into the chair across from me, I want you to understand what kind of woman Maria was. She was not some distant relative who left you property out of guilt or obligation. She loved you. She never stopped believing that someday she would find you and bring you home. Jessica was quiet for a moment, staring out the window toward the pasture. Then she continued, but I also want you to understand that this ranch is not just land and buildings. It is a working operation. It requires knowledge and experience and a level of commitment that most people cannot understand. Maria knew that, and she worried about what would happen to this place after she was gone. Are you saying I cannot handle it? I asked, feeling defensive. I am saying you have never lived on a ranch, Jessica said bluntly. You have never worked cattle or maintained equipment or dealt with drought or disease or any of the 100 things that can go wrong on a place like this. This is not some romantic fantasy about country living. This is hard work every single day with no guarantees and no safety net. I looked around the living room at the evidence of generations of my family who had made this place work, who had built something lasting and meaningful on this land. Maybe I did not have experience, but I had something else. I had a need to belong somewhere, to be part of something bigger than myself. I can learn, I said. Jessica studied me for a long moment. Maybe, she said, but learning takes time, and this place cannot afford mistakes. The cattle need to be fed and watered every day. The equipment needs to be maintained. The books need to be kept. There are a dozen things that could go wrong if someone does not know what they are doing. So teach me, I said, surprising myself with the words. Jessica raised an eyebrow. What? You obviously know how to run this place. You have been doing it for months. If you really cared about my grandmother, if you really want this ranch to succeed, then teach me what I need to know. And what do I get out of that deal? Jessica asked. You get to stay, I said. You get to keep living here while I learn. You get to make sure this place is run the way my grandmother would have wanted. It was a gamble offering to share the property with the woman who was trying to take it away from me. But sitting in that living room, surrounded by evidence of my grandmother's love and my family's history, I realized that this was bigger than just me. This ranch had been built by generations of people working together, and maybe it was time to continue that tradition. Jessica stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her working through the implications of what I had just proposed. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. "You have no idea what you are asking," she said. "Running a ranch is not something you learn in a few weeks or even a few months. It takes years to understand the animals, the weather patterns, the markets. And that is assuming you have the physical and mental stamina for it, which most people do not." "I am willing to try," I said. "I have worked hard jobs before. I have been taking care of myself since I was 8 years old. I think I can handle whatever this place requires." "Taking care of yourself in the city is different from taking care of 650 acres and 50 head of cattle," Jessica said, but there was something in her voice that had changed, a note of consideration that had not been there before. Betty, who had been quietly observing this conversation from the doorway, stepped forward. "Noah," she said, "I think we need to discuss this with Alexander Gomez before you make any agreements. There are legal implications to consider." She was right, of course. I barely knew Jessica Cooper, and an hour ago she had been trying to claim that this property belonged to her. But something had shifted between us when she showed me those photo albums, when she talked about my grandmother's love and determination. I was starting to understand that this was not just about greed or opportunism. This was about a woman who had spent 5 years caring for my grandmother in this ranch, who was facing the loss of the only home she had known since her husband died. "What if we made it official?" I said. "A partnership or some kind of legal arrangement. You teach me how to run the ranch, and in exchange, monsieur, you have a permanent place here." Jessica shook her head. "That is generous, but it would never work long term. You are 18 years old. Eventually, you are going to want to make your own decisions about this place, and you are not going to want some old woman telling you what to do." "You are not that old," I said, which made her smile slightly. "Old enough to know that partnerships between family members rarely work out," Jessica said. "And we are not even family. We are strangers who happen to want the same piece of land. But we both want what is best for this ranch," I said. "We both want to honor my grandmother's memory. Maybe that is enough to start with." Jessica stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the pasture where the cattle were grazing in the afternoon sunlight. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable than it had been before. "Frank and I never had children," she said. "When he died, I thought my life was basically over. Then Maria got sick, and taking care of her in this ranch gave me a purpose again. For the first time in years, I felt like I was needed, like I was part of something important. The idea of losing that, of having to start over again at my age, is terrifying." I joined her at the window, trying to imagine what it would feel like to lose the only home you had known, to face an uncertain future with no family and limited resources. In a way, her situation was not so different from mine. We were both people who had found something precious in this place, something worth fighting for. "What if we tried it for a year?" I said. "A trial partnership. You teach me everything you know about running this ranch, and I learn everything I can. At the end of the year, we evaluate how it is working and decide what to do next. And if you decide you do not want me here anymore," Jessica asked, "then we figure out a fair way to handle it," I said. "Maybe I buy out your interest in the improvements you have made, or maybe we sell the place and split the proceeds. But we agree to give it an honest try first." Jessica turned to look at me, and I could see her weighing the proposal. It was not perfect, and there were a lot of details that would need to be worked out. But it was better than a legal battle that could drag on for months and cost both of us everything. "I would want it in writing," Jessica said finally. "A formal agreement that spells out responsibilities and protections for both of us." "Absolutely," I said. "We can have Alexander draw up the papers." Betty stepped forward again. "Noah, I really think you should take some time to consider this. You have been through a lot of changes in the past few days, and you do not want to make a decision you might regret later." She was probably right, but sitting in my grandmother's living room, looking out at land that had been in my family for generations, I felt more certain about this decision than I had felt about anything in my life. This was not just about inheriting property. This was about finding a place where I belonged, about honoring the family history I had never known I had, about building something meaningful with my life. "I understand your concerns," I told Betty, "but this feels right. I have spent my entire life being moved around, never having any control over my situation. This is the first time I have had the chance to make a real choice about my future, and I want to try to make this work." Jessica was still looking out the window, but I could see a slight smile on her face. "Your grandmother would have liked you," she said quietly. "She always said the Gonzalez family was too stubborn for their own good. But that stubborn streak was what kept this ranch going through good times and bad." "Will you consider it?" I asked. "The partnership, I mean." Jessica turned back to me, and for the first time since we had met, her expression was genuinely warm. "Yes," she said, "I will consider it. But first, you need to understand what you are getting into. Tomorrow morning, we start at 5:30 with the cattle. You are going to learn what it really means to work this land." I nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and terror. I had never worked with cattle before, had never even been on a ranch except for this one visit. But I was ready to learn, ready to prove that I belonged here. That evening, after Betty had driven back to Houston and I had settled into one of the guest bedrooms in my grandmother's house, I called Alexander Gomez to tell him about the arrangement I had proposed to Jessica. "Are you sure about this, Noah?" he asked. "You could fight her claim and probably win. You do not have to share this property with anyone." "I know," I said, "but I think this is what my grandmother would have wanted. She spent years trying to bring me home, and now I am here. I do not want to start my new life by forcing out someone who cared about her." Alexander was quiet for a moment. "It is your decision," he said finally. "But if you are going to do this, we need to make sure the agreement protects your interests. I will draft something that spells out the terms clearly and gives you options if the arrangement does not work out." "Thank you," I said. "And Alexander, there is something else. Jessica mentioned that there might be people in town who do not think I belong here, who might support her claim over mine. Is that something I need to worry about?" "Possibly," Alexander said. "Cedar Creek is a small town, and people there have their own ideas about how things should be done. But legally, their opinions do not matter. You are the rightful owner of this property, and no one can change that." After I hung up the phone, I walked through my grandmother's house again, taking in all the details I had missed during my first visit. In the kitchen, I found a recipe box filled with handwritten cards for things like chicken and dumplings and peach cobbler. In the living room bookshelf, I discovered a collection of ranch management guides and agricultural journals that showed how seriously my grandmother had taken the business side of this operation. But it was in her bedroom that I found the most meaningful discovery. In the bottom drawer of her dresser, wrapped in tissue paper, was a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth from years of handling, and when I opened it, I found page after page of entries written in my grandmother's careful handwriting. The early entries were about daily ranch activities, weather patterns, cattle breeding records, and financial information. But as I read further, I found entries about her search for me, about her regrets regarding my mother, about her hopes for the future of the ranch. One entry, dated just 6 months before her death, stood out to me. "Today I got another dead end from the private investigator, but I am not giving up. Noah is out there somewhere, and I know that someday he will come home. I have been thinking about what I will say to him when that day comes, how I will explain why it took so long to find him, how I will make up for all the years we lost. I hope he will understand that I never stopped loving him, never stopped believing that this family could be whole again." I sat on the edge of my grandmother's bed, holding her journal and feeling the weight of her love and hope. She had never given up on me, even when the system had made it nearly impossible for us to find each other. The least I could do was honor her memory by making this ranch work, by proving that her faith in me had not been misplaced. Outside, I could hear the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night, cattle lowing in the distance, the wind rustling through the oak trees, the creak of old buildings adjusting to the cooling air. These were the sounds my mother had grown up with, the sounds my grandmother had fallen asleep to for decades. Now they were my sounds, my responsibility, my home. Tomorrow would bring my first real test, my first chance to prove that I belonged on this land. I was nervous, but I was also excited. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. 5:30 in the morning came earlier than I had expected, announced by Jessica banging on my bedroom door with what sounded like a wooden spoon against a metal pot. "Rise and shine, city boy," she called through the door. "The cattle do not care if you are tired." I stumbled out of bed, my body still adjusting to the unfamiliar sounds and smells of the ranch. Through my window, I could see the first pale light of dawn creeping across the pasture, and I could hear Jessica moving around in the kitchen, the sounds of coffee brewing and breakfast being prepared. When I made it to the kitchen, Jessica was standing at the stove, scrambling eggs and frying bacon. She was wearing work clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt, and boots that looked like they had seen years of hard use. She looked up when I entered, taking in my city clothes and sneakers with obvious disapproval. "First lesson," she said, pointing at my feet, "you cannot work cattle in tennis shoes. You need boots, real boots with a heel and a hard toe. There should be some in the mudroom that might fit you." I found a pair of worn leather boots that were only slightly too big and laced them up as tightly as I could. When I returned to the kitchen, Jessica handed me a plate of eggs and bacon and a cup of coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. "Eat fast," she said. "We have 50 head of cattle to check on, and then we need to move them to the south pasture. After that, we will look at the hay situation and check the water troughs." I ate as quickly as I could, trying to process everything she was telling me. Moving cattle sounded complicated and potentially dangerous. I had seen cowboys in movies, but I had a feeling that real ranch work was going to be very different from what Hollywood had shown me. After breakfast, Jessica led me out to the barn, a massive red structure that smelled like hay and leather and animals. Inside, there were stalls for horses, storage areas for equipment, and a workshop area with tools I did not recognize. Jessica walked over to a stall where a large brown horse was waiting patiently. "This is Ranger," she said, stroking the horse's neck. "He was your grandmother's favorite, and he knows this ranch better than most people. He is also gentle enough for a beginner, which is what you are." I had never been on a horse before, but I tried not to let Jessica see how nervous I was. She showed me how to put on the saddle and bridle, explaining each step and making me repeat the process until I could do it without help. Then she led Ranger out of the barn and held the reins while I climbed into the saddle. The ground looked a lot farther away than I had expected, and Ranger felt enormous beneath me, like sitting on top of a mountain that might decide to move at any moment. Jessica adjusted my stirrups and showed me how to hold the reins, then mounted her own horse, a smaller gray mare named Dolly. "We are going to start slow," Jessica said. "Just follow me and let Ranger do most of the work. He knows where we are going." We rode out toward the pasture where the cattle were grazing, and I gradually began to relax in the saddle. Ranger was indeed gentle, responding to the slightest pressure from the reins and seeming to understand that his rider was a complete novice. The morning air was cool and fresh, and from horseback I could see the ranch spread out around me in a way that made me understand why my family had loved this land. The cattle were scattered across several acres of grassland, black and brown shapes moving slowly through the morning mist. Jessica rode among them, counting and checking for any signs of illness or injury. She showed me how to look for cattle that were separated from the herd, how to identify animals that might be sick or lame, how to assess the condition of the grass and water sources. "This time of year," she explained, "we need to move them regularly to prevent overgrazing. The south pasture has better grass right now, and the water source there is more reliable." Moving 50 head of cattle turned out to be both easier and harder than I had expected. The animals seemed to know the routine and were generally willing to follow Jessica's lead toward the new pasture. But there were always a few that wanted to go their own way, and it was my job to ride around the edges of the herd and gently guide the stragglers back toward the group. Ranger seemed to understand this work instinctively, positioning himself to block cattle that tried to wander off and responding to my increasingly confident commands. By the time we had successfully moved the entire herd to the south pasture, I was starting to feel like maybe I could learn to do this job. "Not bad for a first-timer," Jessica said as we closed the gate behind the last of the cattle. "But this was the easy part. Wait until we have to work them through the chutes for vaccinations or branding." After we returned the horses to the barn, Jessica showed me around the rest of the ranch operation. We checked the hay barn, where bales of coastal grass hay were stacked nearly to the ceiling. We examined the water troughs and the automatic feeding systems. We looked at the equipment shed, where tractors and hay balers and other machinery were stored. Everything was well maintained and organized, evidence of years of careful management. Jessica explained how each piece of equipment worked, what maintenance was required, and what could go wrong if things were not properly cared for. "Your grandmother was meticulous about record keeping," Jessica said, leading me to a small office in the barn. "Every animal has a file, every expense is documented, Every breeding decision is tracked. She ran this place like a business, not a hobby. The office was lined with filing cabinets and contained a desk with a computer and printer. Jessica showed me the spreadsheets where cattle records were kept, the files containing veterinary information, the financial records that tracked income and expenses. This is probably the most important part of the operation, Jessica said. You can have the best cattle and the best land in the county, but if you do not manage the business side properly, you will go broke. I looked at the rows of files and computer screens, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of it all. I had always been good with numbers and organization, but this was a level of detail and responsibility I had never encountered before. Can you teach me all this? I asked. I can teach you the basics, Jessica said, but it will take time and you will need to be willing to make mistakes and learn from them. Ranch management is not something you master in a few months. We spent the rest of the morning going through the daily routine, checking water levels, inspecting fences, monitoring the cattle for any signs of problems. Jessica explained the seasonal cycles of ranch work, how spring brought calving season and summer brought hay cutting, how fall was for breeding decisions and winter was for maintenance and planning. By lunchtime, I was exhausted but exhilarated. My legs ached from riding, my hands were shorn from handling tools I was not used to, and I was covered in dust and hay. But I felt more alive and engaged than I had in years. Over lunch, Jessica and I talked about the practical aspects of our potential partnership. She explained the current financial situation of the ranch, which was stable but not particularly profitable. The cattle operation generated enough income to cover expenses and provide a modest living, but there was not much margin for error or major investments. If we are going to make this work, Jessica said, we need to think about ways to improve the operation. Maybe expand the herd or diversify into other activities, or find ways to add value to what we are already producing. What kind of other activities? I asked. Some ranches offer hunting leases or agritourism activities or boarding for other people's horses, Jessica said. Your grandmother always talked about maybe starting a small farmer's market operation, growing vegetables or raising chickens for local sales. I found myself getting excited about the possibilities. For the first time in my life, I was thinking about long-term plans, about building something that could last and grow over time. That afternoon, Jessica introduced me to some of the neighbors. We drove into town to pick up supplies at the feed store, and she made sure to introduce me to everyone we met as Maria's grandson and the new owner of the Gonzalez Ranch. The reactions were mixed. Some people were welcoming and curious, eager to share memories of my grandmother and offer advice about ranch management. Others were more reserved, clearly skeptical about whether a city kid with no experience could successfully run a ranch operation. At the feed store, we met Frank Lee, an older man who owned the ranch adjacent to ours. He looked me up and down with obvious doubt when Jessica introduced me. "So you are Maria's grandson," he said. I heard someone was claiming to be family, but I figured it was just another scam. People are always trying to take advantage of old folks. "It is not a scam," Jessica said firmly. "Noah has legal documentation proving his relationship to Maria." Frank shrugged. "Documentation can be faked. What I want to know is whether this boy knows anything about running a ranch. Maria worked her whole life to build that operation, and it would be a shame to see it ruined by someone who does not know what he is doing." I felt my face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but Jessica put a hand on my arm to keep me from responding. "Noah is learning," she said calmly, "and he has me to teach him. Between the two of us, I think we can keep the ranch running just fine." "We will see," Frank said, but his tone suggested he did not think we would succeed. As we drove home with a truck full of feed and supplies, I asked Jessica about Frank's reaction. "Do not take it personally," she said. "Frank is protective of this community, and he has seen a lot of outsiders come in with big plans and no follow-through. He will come around once he sees that you are serious about this." "What if I'm not good enough?" I asked. "What if I cannot learn everything I need to know?" Jessica was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. Then she said, "Your grandmother spent 10 years searching for you because she believed you had the Gonzalez family spirit. I have spent one day with you, and I can see that she was right. You have the determination and the work ethic. The rest is just knowledge and experience, and those can be learned." That evening, as we sat on the front porch watching the sunset over the pasture, I felt a sense of peace and belonging that I had never experienced before. This was hard work, and there would be many challenges ahead. But for the first time in my life, I was building something that belonged to me, something that could last. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and satisfying. Every morning at 5:30, Jessica would wake me up, and we would spend the day working cattle, maintaining equipment, and learning the countless details that went into running a ranch. Every evening, I would fall into bed completely worn out, but feeling like I was exactly where I belonged. Alexander Gomez came out to the ranch to finalize our partnership agreement. The document spelled out our responsibilities and protections, giving Jessica a 5-year lease on the ranch house and a percentage of the profits in exchange for her management expertise and training. It was not a perfect arrangement, but it felt fair to both of us. The legal hearing to determine the validity of my grandmother's will was scheduled for the following month, but Alexander was confident that Jessica's cooperation would strengthen our case significantly. Having her testify about my grandmother's mental state and her wishes for the ranch would make it much harder for any other relatives to challenge the inheritance. As I learned more about ranch work, I began to understand why Jessica had been so skeptical about my ability to handle this responsibility. Every day brought new challenges and decisions that required knowledge I did not have. When should we wean the calves from their mothers? How much hay would we need to get through the winter? Which bulls should we keep for breeding and which should we sell? But I also began to see opportunities that Jessica, with her focus on traditional ranch operations, might have overlooked. The location of our ranch, just 2 hours from Austin, made it perfect for weekend visitors who wanted to experience country life. The growing interest in locally produced food created markets for grass-fed beef and organic vegetables that could command premium prices. One evening, as we were reviewing the financial records, I brought up some of these ideas with Jessica. What if we started small, I said. Maybe offered weekend trail rides for city people, or started a small farmers market booth in Austin. We could test the market without making a big investment. Jessica looked skeptical. Your grandmother tried some of those things years ago, she said. The problem is that it takes time away from the core ranch operations, and the profit margins are not that much better than traditional cattle ranching. But we have something now that my grandmother did not have, I said. We have the internet. We could market directly to consumers, build a brand around the family history of the ranch, tell the story of sustainable agriculture and traditional ranching methods. Jessica was quiet for a moment, considering the idea. It is possible, she said finally, but it would require a lot of work. And there are no guarantees. We could spend a lot of time and money on marketing and not see any return on the investment. What if we started with something simple, I suggested. What if we just created a website and social media accounts, started telling people about the ranch and what we do here? See if there is interest before we invest in anything major. That evening, I spent several hours on my laptop researching other ranches that had successfully diversified their operations. I found examples of family ranches that offered educational tours, weekend retreats, farm-to-table dining experiences, and direct sales of beef and other products. Many of them were generating significantly more income than traditional cattle operations. I also discovered that there was a growing movement of young people who were interested in sustainable agriculture and traditional farming methods. These were people who might be willing to pay premium prices for products that were produced ethically and sustainably. The more I researched, the more excited I became about the possibilities. This ranch had everything needed to succeed in these markets. We had a beautiful location, a compelling family story, and Jessica's expertise in traditional ranching methods. What we needed was a way to connect with customers who would value what we had to offer. Over the next few days, I started working on a simple website for the ranch. I used photos I had taken around the property and wrote descriptions of our cattle operation, our commitment to sustainable practices, and the history of the Gonzalez family ranch. I also created social media accounts and started posting pictures of daily ranch life. Jessica was initially skeptical about the whole endeavor, but she became more interested when I showed her examples of other ranches that were successfully using similar marketing strategies. This ranch in Hill Country is getting $30 a pound for their grass-fed beef, I told her, showing her a website on my laptop. They are selling directly to restaurants in Austin and San Antonio, and they have a waiting list of customers who want to buy whole or half animals. $30 a pound, Jessica said, her eyes widening. We are getting maybe $4 a pound at the livestock auction. Exactly, I said. And look at this place near Fredericksburg. They offer weekend ranch experiences where people pay $200 a night to stay in their guest house and help with ranch work. They are booked solid 6 months in advance. Jessica studied the website carefully. That is a lot of money, she said, but it is also a lot of work. You have to deal with customers, maintain facilities, handle reservations and marketing. It is basically running two businesses instead of one, but it is also a way to make this ranch more profitable and sustainable, I said. And it could be a way to honor my grandmother's memory by sharing her love of this land with other people. That weekend, we had our first test of whether there might be interest in what we were offering. I had posted some pictures of our cattle operation on social media, and a family from Austin had reached out asking if they could visit the ranch with their two young children. Jessica was nervous about having strangers on the property, but she agreed to let them come for a short visit. The family, Aaron Robinson and his wife, Donna Robinson, and their kids, arrived on Saturday morning full of excitement about seeing a real working ranch. I gave them a tour of the operation, explaining how we manage the cattle and maintain the land. Jessica demonstrated some basic ranch skills, showing the kids how to brush a horse and collect eggs from the chickens we kept for our own use. The family was fascinated by everything, asking dozens of questions and taking pictures of every aspect of ranch life. At the end of the visit, Aaron asked if we would be willing to sell them some of our grass-fed beef. He had been buying expensive organic meat at the grocery store, but he was interested in purchasing directly from a ranch where he could see how the animals were raised. We do not have the proper licensing for direct sales yet, Jessica told him, but we are looking into it. Well, when you do, Aaron said, we would definitely be interested, and we would love to bring the kids back for another visit sometime. After they left, Jessica and I sat on the front porch, talking about what we had learned from the experience. They seemed genuinely interested, Jessica said, and they were willing to pay a premium for quality products. The kids loved it, I added. They had never seen cattle up close before, or watched someone milk a goat. There is definitely a market for educational experiences like that. Over the next few weeks, we had several more visitors, people who had found us through social media or word of mouth. Each visit taught us something about what people were looking for and what we could realistically offer. We also started the process of getting licensed for direct beef sales, which required working with the state agriculture department and finding a certified processing facility. It was complicated and expensive, but the potential profits made it worthwhile. As we prepared for the legal hearing that would finalize my inheritance, I felt increasingly confident about the future of the ranch. We had a plan for making it more profitable, we had started building a customer base, and most importantly, Jessica and I had developed a working relationship based on mutual respect and shared goals. The hearing itself turned out to be anticlimactic. Alexander presented the evidence supporting my inheritance claim. Jessica testified about my grandmother's mental state and her wishes for the ranch, and the judge ruled in our favor without much deliberation. Jessica Cooper's legal challenge was dismissed, and I was officially recognized as the sole owner of the Gonzalez family ranch. But rather than feeling triumphant, I felt grateful. Grateful to my grandmother for never giving up her search for me. Grateful to Jessica for teaching me what I needed to know to honor my family's legacy. And grateful for the opportunity to build something meaningful with my life. That evening, we celebrated with a barbecue on the front porch, cooking some of our own beef and inviting a few of the neighbors who had become supportive of our efforts. Frank Lee even showed up, bringing a bottle of wine and offering grudging approval of the improvements we had made to the ranch. You are doing right by Maria's memory, he told me. She would be proud of what you are building here. As the sun set over the pasture and our guests shared stories about my grandmother and the history of the community, I felt a deep sense of belonging that I had never experienced before. This was not just about inheriting property. This was about finding my place in a story that had begun long before I was born and would continue long after I was gone. 6 months after I first arrived at the ranch, we hosted our first official agritourism event. It was a small group, just 8 people who had signed up for a weekend ranch experience through our website, but it felt like a major milestone in our journey from traditional cattle operation to diversified agricultural business. The guests arrived on Friday evening, and Jessica and I welcomed them with a barbecue dinner featuring our own grass-fed beef. We had converted the old bunkhouse into comfortable guest accommodations, and we had planned a weekend of activities that would give city folks a taste of real ranch life. Saturday morning started with the usual cattle work, but now we had paying guests who were eager to learn how to move cattle on horseback and check water troughs and repair fences. What had once been just daily chores became educational experiences that people were willing to pay good money to participate in. One of our guests was Victoria Flores, a lawyer from Austin who had grown up on a small farm but had been living in the city for 20 years. She was clearly comfortable around animals and knew her way around farm equipment, but she told me that she had missed the connection to the land that came with agricultural work. "This is exactly what I needed," she said as we worked together to move a small group of cattle to a different pasture. "I had forgotten how satisfying it is to work with animals and see the direct results of your labor." Another guest was Jason Hill, a software engineer who had never been on a ranch before, but was fascinated by the business side of our operation. He spent hours asking Jessica about cattle breeding programs and land management strategies, and he was particularly interested in how we were using technology to market our products. "You could probably automate a lot of these record-keeping tasks," he told me, looking at our manual tracking systems. "There are software programs designed specifically for ranch management that could save you hours of work every week." By Sunday afternoon, when our guests were preparing to leave, we had received commitments for direct beef sales totaling over $3,000, and several people had asked about booking return visits or bringing their families for future ranch experiences. More importantly, we had proven to ourselves that we could successfully combine traditional ranching with hospitality and education. The guests had genuinely enjoyed their weekend, and we had generated more income in 2 days than we typically made in a month from cattle sales alone. That evening, Jessica and I sat in the ranch office reviewing the financial results of the weekend and planning our next steps. "I have to admit," Jessica said, "this is working better than I expected. The profit margins are definitely higher than traditional cattle operations. And the guests seem to really appreciate what we are offering," I added. "They are not just buying beef or paying for entertainment. They are connecting with something authentic, something that has real meaning." Jessica nodded. "Your grandmother always said that this land had the power to heal people, to give them a sense of peace and purpose they could not find in the city. I think she would be happy to see that we are sharing that with others." As our agritourism business grew, we also expanded our direct beef sales operation. We partnered with several restaurants in Austin that were committed to locally sourced ingredients, and we started selling at farmers markets in both Austin and San Antonio. The demand for grass-fed, sustainably raised beef was stronger than we had anticipated, and we were able to command premium prices that made our operations significantly more profitable. We also started offering educational programs for school groups and corporate retreats. These were day-long experiences that included tours of the ranch, hands-on activities with the animals, and presentations about sustainable agriculture and land stewardship. One of our most successful programs was a partnership with a local high school that brought students out to the ranch for a week-long agricultural education experience. Many of these students had never been outside the city, and for them, the ranch represented a completely different way of life. I found myself becoming passionate about these educational programs, partly because I remembered what it felt like to be a young person with no clear direction or sense of belonging. If we could show these students that there were alternatives to traditional urban careers, that there were ways to make a living while also making a positive impact on the land and the community, then we were doing something important. Jessica was initially skeptical about the educational programs, worried that they would be too much work for too little profit. But she gradually came to appreciate the impact we were having on young people, and she became one of our most effective teachers. Watching her work with students, I could see why she had been so successful at managing the ranch. She had a gift for explaining complex concepts in simple terms, and she had the patience to let people learn at their own pace while still maintaining high standards for the work. One afternoon, as we were finishing up a program with a group of high school students from an urban agriculture class, one of the students approached me with a question that caught me off guard. "How did you know this was what you wanted to do?" she asked. I mean, you could probably make more money doing something else, so why choose ranching? I thought about her question for a moment, trying to find a way to explain the journey that had brought me to this place. I did not choose ranching, I said finally. Ranching chose me. I inherited this land from a grandmother I had never met, and I could have sold it and moved on with my life. But being here, working this land, learning about my family history, it gave me something I had never had before, a sense of purpose, a connection to something bigger than myself. The student nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense? That makes, she said. I think a lot of people our age are looking for that kind of connection. That conversation stayed with me for days afterward, partly because it made me realize how much I had changed since arriving at the ranch. A year ago, I had been a kid aging out of the foster care system with no clear direction and no sense of belonging. Now I was running a successful business, teaching other young people about agriculture and land stewardship, and building something that would last long after I was gone. But the conversation also made me think about the broader implications of what we were doing. If we could create opportunities for other young people to connect with agriculture and rural life, we might be able to address some of the larger problems facing both urban and rural communities. Many rural communities were struggling with population decline as young people moved to cities for economic opportunities. At the same time, many urban young people were struggling with a sense of disconnection and lack of purpose. Maybe there was a way to address both problems by creating bridges between urban and rural communities. I started researching programs that were doing similar work, connecting urban youth with agricultural opportunities and creating pathways for people to transition from city life to rural life. I found examples of organizations that were training young people in sustainable agriculture techniques, helping them start their own farming operations, and creating networks of support for beginning farmers. One evening, I presented some of these ideas to Jessica, suggesting that we might expand our educational programs to include longer-term training and opportunities for young people who were seriously interested in agricultural careers. That is a big undertaking, Jessica said. Training programs require a lot of resources and expertise, and there is a lot of liability involved in having young people working on the ranch for extended periods. But it could also be a way to make a real difference, I said, and it could help ensure that there will be a new generation of people who know how to manage land sustainably and maintain rural communities. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, considering the idea. Your grandmother always talked about wanting this ranch to be a place where young people could learn and grow, she said finally. She would probably approve of what you are proposing. That weekend, we hosted a visit from Noah Gonzalez, no relation to me despite sharing the same name, who ran a sustainable agriculture training program in California. He was interested in potentially partnering with us to offer similar programs in Texas. What you have here is perfect for this kind of work, he told us as we toured the ranch facilities. You have the land, the infrastructure, and the expertise. More importantly, you have the passion and the commitment to making a difference in young people's lives. We spent the weekend discussing the practical aspects of creating a training program. It would require additional housing facilities, expanded educational resources, and partnerships with agricultural colleges and certification programs. It would also require a significant investment of time and money. But as we talked about the potential impact of such a program, I became increasingly excited about the possibilities. This could be a way to honor my grandmother's memory while also addressing some of the larger challenges facing agriculture in rural communities. By the end of the weekend, we had agreed to move forward with a pilot program that would bring 6 young people to the ranch for a 3-month intensive training experience in sustainable agriculture and ranch management. The program would combine hands-on work experience with classroom instruction, business training, and mentorship opportunities. Participants would learn everything from cattle handling and pasture management to financial planning and marketing strategies. Most importantly, they would have the opportunity to experience the kind of life that was possible in rural communities, to understand that there were alternatives to traditional urban careers, and to develop the skills and confidence they would need to succeed in agricultural careers. As we began planning for the pilot program, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that day when Betty Nguyen had knocked on my door with a manila envelope full of impossible news. I had gone from being a kid with no family and no future to being someone who was building something meaningful, something that would make a difference in other people's lives. The legal challenges were not over, even after the judge had ruled in my favor. 3 weeks after our victory in court, Alexander Gomez called with news that Jessica Cooper had filed an appeal, claiming that new evidence had emerged that questioned the validity of my grandmother's will. I was in the barn working on repairing a gate that had been damaged by a bull when I took the call. The sound of Alexander's serious voice immediately made my stomach clench with anxiety. "What kind of new evidence?" I asked, setting down my tools and walking outside where I could talk privately. "She claims to have found a more recent will," Alexander said. "According to her lawyer, this document was discovered in a safety deposit box that your grandmother had at a bank in Austin. The will is dated 6 months after the one we presented in court, and it allegedly leaves the entire estate to Jessica." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. "Is that possible?" I asked. "Could my grandmother have written a new will without you knowing about it?" "It is possible," Alexander said carefully, "but it would be highly unusual. Your grandmother and I discussed her estate planning extensively, and she never mentioned having any second thoughts about leaving the ranch to you. If she had wanted to change the will, she would have contacted me." "What do we do now?" I asked. "First, we demand to examine the document," Alexander said. "If it is legitimate, it will have certain characteristics that can be verified. The paper, the ink, the handwriting, the notarization. There are ways to determine whether a will is authentic or whether it has been forged." The word forged hit me like a physical blow. Someone was trying to steal my inheritance by creating fake documents. The ranch that had become my home, the life I was building, the future I was planning, all of it was suddenly in jeopardy again. I walked back to the barn where Jessica was working on organizing the feed storage area. She looked up when I entered, and she must have seen something in my expression because she immediately stopped what she was doing. "What is wrong?" she asked. I told her about the phone call, about the alleged new will, about the possibility that we might have to go through the entire legal process again. Jessica listened without interrupting, her face growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised me. "I know about that safety deposit box," she said. "What do you mean you know about it?" "Your grandmother mentioned it to me several times during her last few months," Jessica said. "She was worried about making sure all her important documents were secure, and she asked me to help her organize her papers. We went to the bank together twice, and I was with her when she put the original will in the safety deposit box." My heart started racing. "So there could be a more recent will?" "No," Jessica said firmly. "There could not be. The last time we went to the bank was 8 months ago, and the will she deposited was the same one that left everything to you. If there is another document in that box, someone put it there after your grandmother died. But how would someone get access to a safety deposit box?" I asked. Jessica's expression darkened. "Frank had a key," she said quietly. "Your grandmother gave him access to the box years ago when she first got sick and was worried about what would happen if something happened to her. She trusted him to handle her affairs if she became incapacitated." "But Frank died 5 years ago," I said. "Yes," Jessica said, "but Jessica Cooper inherited all of his possessions, including that key." The implications of what she was saying hit me like a truck. Jessica Cooper had access to my grandmother's safety deposit box. She could have planted a forged will at any time after my grandmother's death. "We need to call Alexander," I said. We called Alexander immediately and explained what Jessica had told us. He was quiet for a long moment, processing the information. "This changes everything," he said finally. "If Jessica Cooper had access to the safety deposit box, then any documents found there after your grandmother's death are suspect. We need to demand a forensic examination of the alleged will, and we need to investigate when and how it was placed in the box." "Can we prove that it is a forgery?" I asked. "Possibly," Alexander said. "Forensic document examination can determine a lot about when and how a document was created. If the ink is newer than the alleged date, or if the handwriting does not match samples of your grandmother's writing, or if the paper is not consistent with what your grandmother typically used, we can prove it is fake." "What about the bank records?" Jessica asked. "Would not there be a record of when someone accessed the safety deposit box?" "Absolutely," Alexander said. Banks keep detailed records of every access to safety deposit boxes. If Jessica Cooper accessed the box after your grandmother's death, there will be documentation of that. Over the next few days, Alexander worked with investigators to gather evidence about the alleged new will. The bank records showed that Jessica Cooper had indeed accessed the safety deposit box twice after my grandmother's death, once just a week after the funeral and again 2 days before she filed her appeal. When the alleged will was examined by forensic document experts, they found several problems with it. The ink was a different chemical composition than the ink used in other documents my grandmother had written around the same time. The handwriting, while similar to my grandmother's, showed signs of being traced or copied rather than written naturally. Most importantly, the paper was from a batch that had been manufactured 6 months after my grandmother's death. The evidence was overwhelming. Jessica Cooper had forged a will and planted it in the safety deposit box in an attempt to steal my inheritance. When confronted with this evidence, her lawyer withdrew the appeal and Jessica Cooper disappeared from Cedar Creek, leaving behind only a note apologizing for what she had done. I should have felt triumphant, but instead I felt sad and confused. Jessica Cooper had been my grandmother's friend, someone who had cared for her during her final illness. What had driven her to try to steal from me, to dishonor my grandmother's memory in such a terrible way? Jessica, my Jessica, the woman who had become my partner and mentor, was equally shaken by the revelation. "I thought I knew her," she said as we sat on the front porch that evening, watching the sunset over the pasture. "Frank always said she had a good heart, that she just made bad decisions sometimes. But this is beyond bad decisions. This is criminal. People do desperate things when they are scared," I said, trying to understand what had motivated Jessica Cooper's actions. Maybe she really believed that she deserved the ranch, that she had earned it through her years of caring for my grandmother. "That does not excuse what she did," Jessica said. "She tried to steal your inheritance, your family's legacy. She could have destroyed everything your grandmother worked for." We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing what had happened and what it meant for our future. The legal challenges were finally over, but the experience had reminded us how fragile our situation was, how much we had to lose if we were not careful. But it had also shown us something important about our partnership. When faced with a crisis that could have torn us apart, we had worked together to find the truth and protect what we had built. The trust between us had been tested and had proven to be strong. A few days later, we received a letter from Alexander Gomez confirming that all legal challenges to my inheritance had been resolved and that I was now the undisputed owner of the Gonzalez family ranch. But more than that, the letter included information about a trust fund that my grandmother had established, money that she had saved over the years specifically for improvements to the ranch and for my education. The trust contained over $200,000, enough to fund the expansion projects we had been planning and to establish the agricultural training program we had dreamed about. My grandmother had not only left me the land, she had left me the resources I would need to make it thrive. That evening, Jessica and I sat in the ranch office, looking at architectural plans for the new dormitory building that would house participants in our training program. The pilot program was scheduled to begin in 3 months, and we had already received applications from young people across the state who were interested in learning about sustainable agriculture. "You know," Jessica said, looking up from the plans, "I think your grandmother would be proud of what we are building here. This is exactly the kind of thing as she always talked about, using the ranch to help young people find their way in the world." "I think so too," I said, "and I think she would be proud that we did not let Jessica Cooper's actions destroy what we were working toward." As we finalized the plans for the training program, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that day when I first arrived at the ranch with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and a heart full of questions. I had found not just a home, but a purpose, not just an inheritance, but a legacy to build upon. The ranch was no longer just a place where cattle grazed and hay was grown. It was becoming a center for education and innovation, a place where young people could learn about agriculture and land stewardship, a bridge between urban and rural communities. Most importantly, it was a place where I belonged, where I was building something that would last long after I was gone, where I was honoring the memory of a grandmother I had never met, but who had never stopped believing in me. 2 years after I first arrived at the ranch, we hosted our first graduation ceremony for the agricultural training program. Six young people who had spent 3 months learning sustainable farming techniques, business management, and land stewardship were ready to begin their own agricultural careers. The ceremony was held in the barn, which we had decorated with hay bales and wildflowers from the pasture. Family members, local farmers, and representatives from agricultural colleges attended to celebrate the achievements of our first graduating class. As I watched these young people receive their certificates, I thought about my own journey from foster care to ranch ownership. Each of them had their own story of challenges overcome and dreams pursued, but they all shared a commitment to building sustainable agricultural careers and contributing to their communities. Donna Lee, one of our graduates, had grown up in Houston and had never imagined herself working in agriculture until she participated in one of our high school programs. Now she was planning to start a small organic vegetable operation on land her family owned outside the city. Another graduate, Frank Lee, no relation to our neighbor, had been working in construction but had always dreamed of raising cattle. He had used his time in our program to develop a business plan for a small ranch operation and had already secured financing to purchase his first herd. During the ceremony, I gave a speech about the importance of sustainable agriculture and the role that young farmers would play in feeding the world while protecting the environment. But what I really wanted to talk about was the power of finding your place in the world, of discovering work that gives your life meaning and purpose. After the ceremony, we held a barbecue featuring beef from our own herd and vegetables grown in the garden that had become part of our educational program. Local farmers and community leaders mingled with our graduates and their families, creating connections that would support these young people as they launched their careers. Jessica, who had become the director of our educational programs, was in her element, moving from group to group and sharing stories about sustainable farming techniques and the history of agriculture in our region. Watching her work with our graduates, I could see how much she had grown into her role as a teacher and mentor. Later that evening, after our guests had departed and we had cleaned up from the celebration, Jessica and I sat on the front porch with a bottle of wine, reflecting on what we had accomplished. Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you had never inherited this place? Jessica asked. Sometimes, I said. I probably would have struggled for a few years, maybe found some kind of job that paid the bills, but did not really satisfy me. I definitely would not have had the opportunity to build something meaningful like this. And I probably would have lost everything when Maria died, Jessica said. I would have had to start over at my age with no resources and no clear direction. This partnership saved both of us in different ways. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. In the distance, I could hear cattle moving through the pasture, and somewhere an owl was calling from the oak trees near the barn. What do you think the next 5 years will look like? I asked. Jessica smiled. If the past 2 years are any indication, probably nothing like what we expect. But I think we will keep growing, keep finding new ways to use this land to help people and strengthen communities. I hope so, I said. I hope we can create enough opportunities for young people that some of them will choose to stay in rural communities instead of moving to cities. And I hope we can show people that there are ways to make a living while also taking care of the land. The next morning, I woke up early and walked out to the pasture where our cattle were grazing in the morning mist. This had become my favorite time of day, when the ranch was quiet and peaceful, and I could think about the work we were doing and the impact we were having. As I watched the cattle move slowly through the grass, I thought about my grandmother Maria and the letter she had written to me before her death. She had hoped that I would find a sense of belonging on this land, that I would understand the importance of the family legacy she was passing on to me. I think she would be amazed by what we had built here. The ranch was more profitable than it had ever been, thanks to our diversified operations and direct marketing strategies. We were providing educational opportunities for young people and creating bridges between urban and rural communities. Most importantly, we were demonstrating that it was possible to make a living while also making a positive impact on the world. But beyond the business success and the social impact, I had found something even more valuable on this land. I had found a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing from my life for 18 years. I had discovered work that challenged me and fulfilled me, relationships that supported and sustained me, and a community that welcomed and valued me. Standing in that pasture, watching the sun rise over a land that had been in my family for generations, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. The years in foster care, the uncertainty and loneliness, the struggle to find my place in the world, all of it had led to this moment, this place, this life. I also felt a sense of responsibility for the future. This ranch was not just my inheritance, it was a trust that I held for future generations. The work we were doing here, the young people we were training, the sustainable practices we were developing, all of it was part of a larger effort to create a more just and sustainable food system. As I walked back toward the house, I saw Jessica coming out of the barn, carrying a bucket of feed for the chickens. She waved when she saw me, and I could see her smile even from a distance. "Ready for another day?" she called out. "Ready," I called back, and I was ready. Ready for whatever challenges and opportunities the day would bring. Ready to continue building something meaningful on this land. Ready to honor my grandmother's memory and my family's legacy. Ready to help young people find their own sense of purpose and belonging. Most of all, I was ready to continue living a life that had meaning and impact, surrounded by people who cared about the same things I cared about, working on land that connected me to something larger than myself. 5 years after I first walked up the steps of my grandmother's house with a key in my trembling hand, I stood in that same spot, but everything had changed. The ranch that had once been a simple cattle operation was now a thriving center for sustainable agriculture education, hosting over 100 students each year and supplying grass-fed beef to restaurants across Central Texas. Jessica and I had expanded our partnership into a formal business relationship, with her owning a percentage of the operation in recognition of her contributions to its success. We had built new facilities, hired additional staff, and established partnerships with agricultural colleges and sustainable farming organizations across the state. But the most meaningful change was not visible in the buildings or the business records. It was in the young people who had found their calling through our programs, the families who had discovered the value of locally produced food, and the community that had embraced our vision of agriculture as a force for positive change. That morning, I received a call from a young woman named Donna Robinson, who had graduated from our program 3 years earlier. She was calling to tell me that she had just purchased her own farm and was planning to use the techniques she had learned at our ranch to start an organic vegetable operation. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for giving me the chance to discover what I was meant to do with my life. Before I came to your ranch, I was working in an office job that paid well but left me feeling empty. Now I wake up every morning excited about the work I get to do." Calls like that reminded me why we were doing this work, why it mattered to create opportunities for people to connect with agriculture, and find meaningful careers in rural communities. Later that day, I drove into Cedar Creek to pick up supplies at the feed store. Frankly, our neighbor, who had initially been skeptical about my ability to run the ranch, was there loading bags of feed into his truck. "Noah," he called out when he saw me, "how is that training program of yours going?" "Really well," I said. "We just had our 5th graduating class, and most of our alumni are working in agriculture now, either on their own farms or for other sustainable agriculture operations." Frank nodded approvingly. "You know, when you first showed up here, I did not think you had what it takes to make it in this business. But you have proven me wrong. What you and Jessica have built out there is something special." "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot coming from you." As I drove back to the ranch with a truck full of supplies, I reflected on how much my relationship with the community had changed over the years. The skepticism and suspicion that had initially greeted me had gradually given way to respect and support as people saw the positive impact of our work. That evening, Jessica and I sat in the ranch office reviewing applications for our next training program. We had received over 200 applications for 20 spots, a testament to the growing interest in sustainable agriculture careers. "Look at this one," Jessica said, handing me an application from a young man in Dallas who had been working in technology but wanted to transition to farming. He has a computer science degree and experience in data analysis. He could probably help us develop better systems for tracking our environmental impact and optimizing our operations. "And this one," I said, pointing to an application from a young woman who had grown up on a small farm but had studied business in college. She wants to learn how to make small-scale agriculture more profitable and sustainable. As we reviewed the applications, I was struck by the diversity of backgrounds and experiences represented. These were not just people who had grown up on farms and wanted to continue family traditions. These were urban professionals, recent college graduates, career changers, and young people who were looking for work that aligned with their values and gave their lives meaning. The next morning, I woke up before dawn and walked out to the pasture where our cattle were grazing. This had become my daily ritual, a time for reflection and planning before the busy day began. As I stood there in the early morning light, I thought about the letter my grandmother had written to me, the one I had found in her dresser drawer on my first day at the ranch. She had hoped that I would find a sense of belonging on this land, that I would understand the importance of the legacy she was passing on to me. I had found much more than belonging. I had found my life's work, my purpose, my calling. This ranch had given me not just a home, but a mission that got me up every morning with enthusiasm and energy. I thought about all the young people who had come through our program, the connections they had made, the skills they had learned, the confidence they had gained. Each of them represented a small victory against the forces that were pulling young people away from rural communities in sustainable agriculture. But I also thought about the larger challenges we still faced: climate change, soil degradation, water scarcity, the concentration of agricultural land in the hands of large corporations. The work we were doing at our ranch was important, but it was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. As the sun rose higher and I prepared to head back to the house for breakfast, I felt a renewed sense of commitment to the work we were doing. This ranch was not just my inheritance anymore. It was my contribution to building a more sustainable and just food system. That afternoon, I received a call from a reporter who was writing a story about young people who were choosing agriculture as a career. She wanted to interview me about my journey from foster care to ranch ownership, about the programs we had developed, and about my vision for the future of sustainable agriculture. During the interview, she asked me what advice I would give to other young people who were considering careers in agriculture. I would tell them that this is hard work, I said, but it is also incredibly rewarding work. You get to see the direct results of your labor. You get to work with the land and with animals. You get to feed people and take care of the environment. Most importantly, you get to be part of something bigger than yourself, part of a movement to create a more sustainable and just world. She also asked me what I had learned from my experience of inheriting the ranch and building it into what it had become. I learned that family is not just about blood relationships. I said, it is about the people who support you and believe in you and work alongside you to build something meaningful. Jessica became family to me, and so did many of the young people who have come through our programs and the community members who have supported our work. I also learned that belonging is not something you are born with. It is something you create through your actions and your commitments. I found my place in the world by working to make this ranch a place where other people could also find their place. After the interview, I walked through the ranch, visiting all the places that had become meaningful to me over the years. The barn where I had learned to saddle a horse, the pasture where I had moved my first herd of cattle, the office where Jessica and I had planned our expansion, the dormitory where dozens of young people had lived while learning about sustainable agriculture. Each of these places held memories of growth and learning, of challenges overcome and goals achieved. But more than that, they held the promise of future growth and learning, of new challenges and new achievements. That evening, as Jessica and I sat on the front porch watching the sunset, I told her about the interview and the questions the reporter had asked. What do you think the next 5 years will bring? I asked her. More growth, more students, more impact, Jessica said, but also more challenges. As we get bigger, we will need to be careful not to lose the personal touch that makes our program special. I agree, I said. I want us to keep growing, but I want us to grow in a way that honors the values and relationships that have made us successful. As the stars came out over the pasture, I thought about all the people who had played a role in bringing me to this place. My grandmother Maria, who had never stopped searching for me. Betty Nguyen, who had delivered the news that changed my life. Alexander Gomez, who had fought to protect my inheritance. Jessica, who had taught me everything I needed to know about ranching and had become my partner in building something meaningful. Most of all, I thought about all the young people who had come through our programs and who were now building their own agricultural careers, contributing to their communities, and working to create a more sustainable future. If you are watching this and you are wondering where you belong in the world, if you are looking for work that has meaning and purpose, I want you to know that there are opportunities out there waiting for you. Maybe it is in agriculture, maybe it is in something else entirely. But whatever it is, do not give up on finding it. And if you have found your place, your purpose, your calling, I encourage you to use it to help others find theirs. Share your knowledge. Open doors for young people. Build bridges between communities. We all have something to contribute to making the world a better place. Subscribe to hear more stories like this one, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what you are doing to build a better future in your own community. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that they belong somewhere, that their life has purpose and meaning. The ranch that saved me from a life of uncertainty and isolation has become a place where dozens of young people have found their calling and their community. That is the power of belonging, the power of finding your place in the world and using it to help others find theirs.